So maybe we can start with, who you are, where you're based, and what you're working on.
Okay, so I'm a product accessories designer, and I'm based in UK near Oxford. I work with a lot of different pet projects, a variety of different categories. So from things like leashes and collars to things like harnesses, as well as bags to carry pets, different pets, bags to carry snacks for pets, bags for walking. I mean, all sorts of things in a variety of aesthetics. And I help clients with the concept side of it, as well as dealing with production side. So from start of the product and validating the idea to getting it produced and launched and sold. So, yeah.
Ooh, yeah, that must be such a fun job.
Uh, it has variety. It's fun. It's also quite unpredictable. But what I think
Yeah,
is nice and fun is when people come to this new and they want to do a project new, they have usually a very fresh take on it. So it's quite fun because you can always like reinvent the wheel and try
yeah,
new things with people and experiment. So I love the fact that you kind of sometimes like, why don't do that? It's
right.
fun.
Yeah, that's really amazing. And I've always been curious, out of all of these different products, what is the hardest to design and what is the easiest?
Um, I think the hardest thing to design is a simplest product. Because it's simple, it's every single detail has to work well, and people pay attention more when it's simple. So the
Mm,
execution has to be spotless. And products that have a lot of features are easier to hide behind. So let's say there is a bag that carry a lot of different snacks for a dog. It's so easy to hide behind lots of compartments. But a collar, it's simple, it's deceptively simple, but you have to make sure that it's a really nice product. So it's it's easy to make a tech pack for it, but you really have to develop it well with a good factory to the right price point. So does this answer your question?
yes, I had a feeling it was going to be a surprise because I think naturally one would think, oh yeah, collar or leash is so simple. It must be so easy and so quick to design, but actually not always the case. So yeah, that totally makes sense. And and I want to dive a little into the entire process. So people would come to you with some ideas, with a vision, and then you would design it. Do you usually, do like a sketch with a pen, or is there a specific software?
um, So for pet projects, mostly it's conceptualizing the idea. Now, if it's something fairly standard, then easiest thing to go into Photoshop or Illustrator and just create a layout for it for a tech pack. When it's something that is experimental, so let's say there is a shape that's not quite straightforward, then it's about manipulating it in 3D. So it can be manipulating it in paper until you achieve the desired silhouette, or it's manipulating it in virtual 3D, so like Gravity Sketch in VR, where you can really quickly and fast experiment with a silhouette until you get that aha moment, oh, that feels kind of cool. And also, it's about playing with the eye, so you take your idea and you kind of do a few variations with different softwares like Midjourney, for example, and then you take it back into Photoshop until you get something that you're happy with. So it depends on the project and it depends on the process. It's every client is different and every project takes you in a different direction, and the tools are used depending on what is required.
I see. Okay, so your focus at GingerKoiki, which is your design company, is to bring your clients' visions for design to life and then deliver a tech pack which includes all the specifications for how a manufacturer can produce it.
Yes, help the client define their vision through the colors, the textures, the aesthetics, the hardware detailing, custom hardware if the client requires a custom hardware, the actual product, certain bronzing elements that naturally lend themselves to it. And then I also work with the clients to develop it with the factory, because I'm sure you know that. One thing
Mhm.
is a tech pack and it can look really pretty. Another thing is what comes out of it. And it's about negotiating a lot of things until the product looks exactly how the client wants it to look. And sometimes during the development process with the factory, there's a lot of innovation happens, which I think is the most fun part, is
Mm.
you sometimes come out with an entirely novel idea because the client tested the sample, they put it on the dog, they're like, oh, what if this? And I'm like, oh, this is so cool. Yeah, let's do that. So the innovation happens in the sampling, not on the tech pack. Let's put it this way.
Okay, yeah. I think this would be of interest to a lot of listener here because finding a manufacturer and prototyping and actually bringing production to life on sale, it actually takes a lot of work and a lot of trial and error and a lot of successes and failures in the process too. So, what would be your recommendation for people who are looking to establish relationships with, let's say, a leash factory?
Well, I think it really depends on the client's budget and what they want. Because if somebody wants to move into the market fast, I would say stick to something simple and don't complicate it. So as little as possible of custom elements, because they take time and they take extra work either on the designer side because you have to separately source them. If somebody starts out with a small like you, sometimes the factory doesn't want to do too much custom elements. So you have to go separately to develop those if you want really good outcome. Because in my experience, when you come to a factory and you say, I want this really custom hardware, I also want this really custom pattern printed on this really custom texture, and I want all of this on very small minimum quantity, the factory will find an easiest solution to make it happen, but sometimes it's not in the interest of the client. Because at the end of the day, they have to make it fast, they have to make it to the price point. And people often find that they're surprised, they're like, oh, why is it like this? But it's like, well, the factory has to make a profit. And so you have to kind of respect, they have to make the money and it has to be a viable business. And people sometimes get a bit like, disappointed, I would say. So it's about like simplifying it and not changing direction halfway mid through, because that really delays the project. And that's very common, but that's an advice for every type of product. Like, I was given this advice in the software. Don't go and change, your direction midway through the project, like, because you'll never get it done. It's going to cost you 3 times more, and you're just not going to get there.
Yeah.
So it's about really being strict with like, no, we're sticking to this direction. We're going to stick to this. We're not going to, unless of course there is something so amazing that comes during this process. They're like, okay, let's just scrap everything and start fresh. Can happen, does happen, quite normal, but just a bit being aware of it.
Yeah, I really resonate with that because when I first started printing comfort cards for people who are grieving pet loss, it was like I thought it was so simple, right? Like you just provide the factory with a PDF of your design and then okay, let's say like you want to add a phrase or like add a new card into the pack. I would just kind of like after I placed a production order, I would tell the factory, "Oh, actually, can you add this for me?" And then they like I can literally like tell they're going crazy. They're like, "Don't do this." That's exactly like not super lean as most people would imagine. Like for example with Shopify, with our Shopify website, we can easily make updates as we go. But like when you're placing a production order with a manufacturer, it really is not. You should think about the work that you place, you send them for production as final for the most part.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, once you get your golden seal sample and after that you're changing it, I mean, that's a good way to lose the factory in the process. Um, um, yeah, um, that's so true. Um, Yeah,
Yeah,
that's very true.
and what do you think it's possible, or is it recommended for a client, let's say, to take one design and then to sample from, let's say, five different factories, and then take it all the way to right before the contract in order to have the most, in order to be able to tease out the best quality producer?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, yeah, I would say that is would be reasonable, and I think a lot of factories understand, and that's what the client is doing, because you learn based on the quality of each factory how to improve the product as well, because everybody looks at it from a different angle. So, you know, it's good to sample with at least three factories
Mm,
and learn on the process. And also you start noticing what's the chemistry between the client and the factory, because there has to be a chemistry between the project and the level of the project and the volume and the factory's willingness. Uh, you know, sometimes the project is either too big for a factory or too small, and there's nothing wrong with the factory or the client. It's just not matching to each other. Um, so, and I also think it's quite important to look after the factory, to be really nice to them, because, you know, it's so easy to upset them. And I think that when people start out this, it's kind of really important to respect the craftsmanship of the factories and their expertise, because people, you know, they know more. So it's about really being very nice to the factory, but also challenging them, because sometimes they just say no, but it's not always no. It's just, you know, sometimes you have to explore that.
yeah, yeah, that's fair. And I imagine there would be different regions, depending on where, which product you're trying to make. So, for example, for leashes, it would be like a specific region of the world where you're sourcing from, and it would be slightly different for bags.
I think it depends on the bags and it depends on the leashes. I It really depends on the market level and the price point and the aesthetic that the client is looking for. And there's so there's different considerations the clients have. Sometimes people specifically want to produce something in Europe. Then it's
Mm,
about optimizing everything to make it work for Europe, including designing the product with that in mind. Sometimes the client wants to produce in Asia, and then it's about optimizing the product for that, as well as choosing a factory that fits the construction capabilities. And so what I usually do is understanding the pricing and everything, and then you start seeing how you optimize the product depending on the client's branding, aesthetic, and everything else. Because some of the leashes and collars, if let's say it's very traditional, like leatherwork, you can produce them with saddlery manufacturers or belt manufacturers. And the handbag factories also can produce perfectly nice leashes and collars. But it it really depends. There isn't one rule. It's just you kind of have to see what's the quality. Let's say there is a very specific, elegant looking waist bag that you want with your leash. Then you kind of better to bring it to a factory that does really nice bags, because they can do both of the items. Because leashes and collars are fairly simple. Um, yeah.
I see. Is there a generalization, that you can share about like where you're generally sourcing from? Like what kind of country, what kind of city are you sourcing for what kind of products?
I source from everywhere. So let's say I don't source from specific country and from specific region. I source depending on the client's targets. So to give you an example, for example, let's say the client comes to me and says, well, I have this idea and I want very small quantities and I want this to be at the premium level. Now, and I want a few, let's say, custom elements. From my experience, my first instinct would be to go to the factories that do smaller quantities, and are willing to work with a client like this. And a lot of them are within like Europe or let's say Turkey, um, because they are optimized for that, and they're going to be happy with a small order. They will charge more, but they're happy with that. But if the client has the budget and is quite confident and they want a product that they're willing to commit to, let's say 300 to 500 units, and they're perfectly fine, and they have the budget and volume, then we can go to different parts of Asia. And it also depends. So let's say the client wants to experiment with any particular like leathercraft manipulations within the product. Then I would advise them to go, let's say, to India, because in India you have quite a lot of factories that like a lot of different leather manipulations. So you can really experiment with different weaves and stuff. And they have a lot of like ready things to test from. And let's say the client is based in US and they want to manufacture locally to US, then it would be going into like US or Mexico and optimizing the product. So sometimes it's simplifying the product so there's less labor cost involved and you have kind of better materials but less manual work. So also for Europe, it will be less kind of detailing involved and simplifying it, because that's kind of what works best. It's kind of custom. That's the thing. And within Europe, let's say we take Europe because recently I've been sourcing a lot in Europe. You can go to Portugal, you can go to Spain, you can also explore different areas like Hungary. You can go to Turkey. And they all have different capabilities. So let's say somebody wants vegan specifically factories. There are some factories that specialize only with vegan materials. So if the client wants vegan product, then it's advisable to go to factories who already have experience with that, because the factories that only produce leather are sometimes reluctant and they don't really want to work with vegan, or they don't know. And so you have a slightly longer learning curve because some of the materials have issues in production and are difficult to work with. So you kind of specialize, then just go to those people. But you always kind of work with a good fit. So you don't try to go to a factory that's not a good fit, because then there's just more problems for a client. And also it's about looking for a response that's more friendly and cooperative. So if somebody appears to be difficult from the start, there's a good chance they're going to be difficult later too. It's not going to change. So it's about, but let's not make our life harder, because it's hard as it is to develop a product and get it launched. And another thing which is quite important is obviously make a QC assessment when the order is produced. Because in my experience, production often changes. So from the gold seal sample to production can look very different to the gold seal sample. I've seen it in many different countries. I'm quite familiar with it. Even when I worked myself in a factory, that happened in front of my nose in the factory when I've developed the product, and then in production just tweaked it. And I'm like, right, that doesn't look quite like my sample, but so it's a very common thing. It's just about watching for it. Everybody tries it, like.
Interesting. So how would you recommend clients go about with their QCs then? Like, should they hire a freelancer?
Well, first of all, getting a good report. So you have your final gold seal sample. Then you prepare a very good report of all the things about the sample, all the photographic evidence of everything. And then you send to the factory this report and say, look, when there's a QC team will come, this is what they will use as the evidence. So if the production looks different, obviously it's a factory problem. It's also negotiating this from in advance, that the factory is not going to say, I don't know anything about it, because sometimes factory does not want to rework the product, and you have to kind of prepare yourself and save yourself in advance that they agree that once it gonna comes to production, they are gonna rework it. They promise you they're gonna rework it, because you don't want to be in a situation where they don't want to do anything and you end up losing money. And this can happen, and this can happen in quite expensive products, so it can cost the client a lot of money. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's a really good tip to create a report once we have a sample that we really like and we want to mass produce, and then have the factory actually agree to it. Do you recommend signing a contract with a QC report attached as well before placing the final production order?
So sorry, the QC contract, could you say it again?
Yeah, would you recommend that we sign contracts with the supplier with the QC evaluation criteria and the contract?
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And then in terms of the actual QC, for companies that are, smaller that don't have in-house QC, how would they usually go about conducting QC?
Well, you hire a QC person, so even if it's an order of 100 units, you can still hire a QC person. What I wouldn't advise is to send the designer to do that
Mm,
because, and I have been in a situation where clients think that the designer would be the best person to do it, but they're not because you have to be trained to do it. And
mm,
first of all, it's quite a repetitive work. Like I've done it myself working inside the factory. You have to be trained to do it because your concentration level can slip quite fast when you check 100 units. You have to check
yeah.
them for so many different things. And you just want this to be a trained person who really knows what they're doing and they're going to do it well. So I wouldn't advise people to do it themselves to save money because sometimes it's better to just invest in those things because you have your peace of mind. You also look good with factory. The factory knows you're serious. The factory knows that you're being professional and it looks better. So that would be my recommendation. Of course, it's okay to test raw materials. So if people want to save money and they come in, the raw material sent to the factory and the factory doesn't want to test it because that's not paid for, you can come in and test the leather yourself. That's okay. But still, it depends how many skins of leather you have to go through because that also it, these are highly time-consuming things, in reality.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. We're always better off hiring experts for whatever they're known to do. And designers are known to design, they're not QC professionals. So in terms of identifying these people and identifying, are there generally databases that you go for? Let's say a client comes to you and they're saying, "Oh, I want, this type of porcelain for pet bowls." How would you then go about looking into your directory and your network to see which manufacturer could be right?
So let's say it's a porcelain for a pet bowl. That will depend on what are the quantities and what's the client's brand, because that will, reflect the sourcing strategy for it. But usually I either look at what existing brands on the market already use for factories. So let's say it's Import Genius. So you can go to Import Genius, look at the brands, and then from there you figure out who is the factory that
Mm,
they're using for which product. And you can access a lot of it for free. But if it's quite small volume and you find the factory is quite big, usually they don't really respond to you. It only
mm,
works if you're willing to order a lot of quantities. Um, I just go through the network of asking people I know, and also looking at the trade shows. Um, looking at trade shows, looking at specific hubs. So let's say, the first thing that comes to mind, if it's porcelain, let's say it's going to be in Europe, I would think there would be someone like Portugal, because Portugal does a lot of like ceramic stuff. You have websites like Open Hub where a lot of brands publish their factories, so they're all on the open kind of map, and you can start looking on that to look for that, because there's going to be established companies that work with a lot of big brands, so they went through a lot of checks, they're reliable.
mm,
Sometimes it's about looking. It's like, let's say I know that in a specific country I should be able to find this because I saw some other brands producing this country. Sometimes I might go as manual as I'm going to look on a map on Google and I'm going to literally track the whole country until I find it. Sometimes I found amazing factories like this just on the Google Maps.
wow.
Uh,
Uh,
and yeah, it's like I needed factory in very specific country and I did found the factory. They work for a lot of famous brands like this, you know, like I find it so far for me this was the most useful strategy, to be honest. I know it sounds strange, but that's just it works, you know.
Yeah, it really sounds like a lot of work and perhaps an opportunity for somebody to come in and like do a database, like a database for all kinds of factories. That would be so easy.
Yeah, but the problem with databases is when somebody has a database that, like, let's say, and it's a bit too popular, those factories stop responding. You know, so it's about like keeping some of these factories a bit, not bothering them too much, because I'm also being very mindful of my existing leads. Is I try to be mindful, because
Mm,
you kind of don't want to bother people far too much, and you want to be very careful, because factories need to be looked after. You have to be nice to factories, and it's quite
mm,
important to be nice. It's
yeah.
quite a
Mm,
very, very important for good
right.
business, I'd say.
Yeah. Yeah. So some information is better kept private.
Sometimes for the benefit of not harassing the factory too much. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's fair. And in terms of QC personnel, how do you go about finding?
So if sometimes it's just there are companies that do that depending on the location. Sometimes, like, I also ask through the network, like I needed very specific factory in specific countries, so I did a bit of general search, and then from there I'm like, you know, do you know somebody in this country? And then they recommend me somebody. But what is important with the QC people um, is also see if there is a, personally, I find when it's a bigger company, I trust it a bit more, because when it's a smaller person, that sometimes I had experience in the past, let's say you hire this person, they're like, yeah, I'm going to take percentage of this order and then a PC. And I didn't quite like the result, because I'm not sure they were particularly on my side, if that makes sense, when they went
Mm,
in, because maybe they're like, oh, maybe I'll get business from this factory. So I would go with a bigger company, because then I trust it more within this space, because QC it's a lot of things can go wrong, and
mm.
QC sometimes you don't know whose interest the person is in.
So bigger companies, as in, are there like professional QC companies?
Yes, so I think there is one called Topwin. I'm very happy to give these details. It's just in my head right now. I'm trying to remember. And I think one of them is Topwin. Um, that I know does QC variety in a quite a big established company, and I've seen that they're reliable. They do good work and they check things properly. Uh, for another one, I might need to. I just don't remember right now the name.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. That's really helpful. Yeah, so it sounds like generally for factories there are certain hubs such as Import Genius and Open Hub where people can go and find. And also for QC, if clients need QC, then they can go to bigger companies such as Tokwin, the one you mentioned, and a couple other QC companies. But also there are some individuals that you can find through your network. So yeah,
And plus, I find sometimes with QC, you can just literally Google it, and you'll find, like, you Google for specific country, you Google in the local language of that country. If you can't find it in English, then that also works. Um, those things are easier to find than
right,
factories,
right,
These are not
yeah,
difficult ones.
yeah, yeah,
And also search on LinkedIn sometimes,
exactly.
depending on where it is. It's just see by country, yeah. But I'm
Okay.
happy
Yeah.
to give the details, that's no
Yeah.
problem.
Okay. Sounds good. Yeah. Yeah. So just to let you know, we have a WhatsApp group for people who are in the pet friendly community, especially the podcast guests. So I'll add you to it after, and if our audience or other podcast guests have questions, then you would be able to answer that and also share more about what you do. So yeah, that's super helpful. And I think as we wrap up the session, what would be some of your top advice for clients, especially startups who are looking to develop pet products?
Um, I think it's about understanding that things are gonna cost more than you think they will.
Okay.
So allocating budget, a lot of extra budget for contingency. Um, there is an element that a lot of people feel quite um, giddy when they start, like amazing now, starting out, like oh my god, and it's about an element of humility, in a
Mm,
sense, accept that there's many things you don't know,
yeah.
and like if experts that you hire suggest things, it's good to listen to it because they might save you a lot of money in the long run, and that's kind of their job, to save you a lot of money in the long run. And often people, they they have this like confidence, I can do everything, and then they crash. There's always an element of a crash, and like,
Mm,
oh, it wasn't as great as I thought it would be, and then they kind of start being realistic. But you're gonna save so much hassle if you're gonna start a little bit careful and just like cautious, and rather than go high and then crash, lose a lot of money, and then kind of like become a bit realistic about it. So yeah.
mm, yeah. Yeah, that is a key to success there, but also really hard to balance because as entrepreneurs, we're so excited about the end vision, but sometimes can get caught in what happens in between, which is extra costs, extra failures that we never accounted for when we first started. So that's a really good advice. And in terms of working with designer, finding designers to design a pet product, any advice there or pitfalls?
I think it's important to find somebody that you have a chemistry with, because I think this is more important than the person's credentials, because if you have that
Mm,
chemistry, you can really innovate together. And a lot of innovation happens when one side suggests something, another side suggests something, and then you have magic. And so you need this person so you're gonna have this magic with,
mm,
um, which is really important. And also sometimes designers may suggest, look, maybe this is not possible, maybe this is not possible, maybe this is not possible. And they might just be coming from a place of trying to save your life a little bit at the start, which can to people feel a bit like, oh, they're not being nice to me, I can't do this, and why they're so difficult. They're not being difficult.
mm,
They're trying to help, but it comes across, and I've seen clients getting really upset with factories. Well, like, why factories like telling me I can't do this and I can't do this? Like, well, they're trying to look after your profit. They're trying to make you money. They know that you're not going to sell it if it's going to be that expensive. You're not going to sell it. You're going to put all this money and you're going to lose it all. And it's so easy to lose a lot of money in developing a product. It's amazing how much money you can lose so fast. So just kind of good to pay
mm.
attention sometimes, like.
Yeah. So would you say to the point of controlling budget when you're developing a product, is it to be really upfront with the designer as well as the factory, what kind of budget that we're working with for this entire product line? And also constantly be asking the designer and the factory, okay, how else can we simplify the product so that we control the cost?
Yes, I totally agree with you, because what happens more often is people get excited and they're like, oh, can we have this? Can we have this? Can we have this? And then like, oh, why is it so expensive? It's like,
Mm-hmm.
we have to do this. That's why it's expensive. So yeah, if the person is constantly realistic and careful and watchful, um, it's important, because obviously everybody is gonna try to help to bring the vision together. So everybody else, the factory and the designer, is going to take the lead from the clients, because it's about helping the clients, not being in charge of the client's project. It's more like, the client is in charge and everybody else is helping. So
Mm,
yeah, I agree with you.
okay. Yeah. These are really great reminders for all of our audience here. If people need to find you, is it to go on your website, gingerkoiki.com?
Yeah, you can go on my Instagram. Yeah, and drop me an email. That's just,
Okay.
I'm more than happy to just I'll answer questions and stuff and
Yes.
and
Yes.
take in the
That's
right direction.